You can't reject your endowment without rejecting the mission you've already committed to go on, or your wedding. I think that had I not already been committed to serve a mission, maybe I would have left at that point. You always have to be within sight and sound of your companion. You have to sleep in the same room, but not in the same bed. So you're always being watched, and you're always being having someone looming over you. I remember sometimes blowing my nose living there, and it would just be dirt. I'm serving a mission. I'm paying to be here. I'm not speaking to my family for months on end. And the best that they can do is put us in a home with a hoarder. You're supposed to wake up at 6:30. And if you wake up at 6:31, that is disobedient. Anyone waking up at 6:31 is telling the Lord that they are not willing to do what it takes in order to convert people to the church. And so you're always viewing every single person you meet as a project that you can basically use as a way to get those numbers that you've committed to be able to get each week. You're told that you represent Jesus Christ literally, and you are also told not to help people. The baptism is probably one of the last things these people need right now. They need food, or they need shelter, or they were recently abused. And here I am just trying to say, will you commit to a baptismal date like a monster? You feel like a little bit like a monster. This is the culmination of my entire religious experience. This is what you've led me to do. How could you have led me into this?
Yeah.
I regret my Mormon mission.
Hey, my name is Shelise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you'd like to see our faces, go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness. We just absolutely love when you guys can interact with a post. It boosts the algorithm. It helps our guests feel seen, heard, validated, and we also love hearing your own experiences in the comments as well. We did create a sister channel at Cults to Consciousness Clips, where you can find 8 to 10 minute snippets of our show that we're resurrecting from previous episodes. That link is in the description. So today's guest, you guys have been asking for this collab for a long time, and we finally were able to make it happen. She is part of what I call the home team cult, which is Mormonism. And she has her own very, very, very successful platform over on YouTube, and actually all of the other social media platforms as well, talking about Mormonism, her experience, her mission experience, BYU experience, and all of the other things that everyone wants to know about Mormonism. It is skyrocketing so fast, she's going to pass us in like a month, but I'm rooting for her. It's so awesome. We're going to dive into her story with BYU and her mission, and kind of what it was like to intentionally overcorrect out of spite, not wanting to be some sort of like Mormon housewife. So all of those things are going to get into today. Hopefully we have time. Thank you so much for joining us, Alyssa Grenfell.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I know every single day I swear there's a comment that's like, you've got to get on Cults to Consciousness. So I'm so excited to collaborate. And just a quick pitch, you can go, Shelise is coming on my channel, and we're going to release the videos on the same day. So check them both out. And I'm super excited to share my story, because I feel like your platform and the way that you share people's stories is super important. And I've watched so many at this point and just learned so much. So I love that we both get to claim the home team cult.
Yes. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing. And I think there's just so much that we need to get into. And like I said, your platform has just skyrocketed in 8 months. You're like already, what, 240,000 subs?
Yeah, something. I think I'm still 230 something.
230 something.
It really has been. I mean, it's so crazy. I think when you first leave a religion like Mormonism, you're so embroiled in it that you almost can't. It's like when you've only seen in black and white, there's no way you could describe color. And to me, the way that people have just responded, and have, like, to your channel as well, to Mormon stories, is shocking, in the sense that you kind of think that maybe only other ex-Mormons will be interested in what you have to say and sharing your experience, when in reality, so many people have reached out from all walks of life, men, women, all different religious backgrounds, atheists, people in Europe, people all over the world are so interested in learning from our stories and learning from everything to do with the doctrine to the bureaucracy of it all to personal experiences. So it's been kind of amazing to see the response.
Yeah. So we're getting into your personal story here. And then, like you said, on your channel, we're going to be getting into all the kinky sex stuff that everyone wants to know about and all the Mormon loopholes. So I'm excited for that because, I like to play around with all that crazy Mormon stuff. And it's fun to get a little silly every now and then.
I agree.
So let's talk about a little bit about your childhood, just like any highlight moments that you want to talk about that kind of led you to going to school at BYU. And for those who aren't familiar, we will describe what BYU and why it's important in the Mormon context.
Yeah, so my childhood, I think, was one of the most devout examples of Mormonism that you could probably hold up as an example. We followed every single little rule. I have a memory of my grandma asking my sister and me for some of our favorite numbers. We were at a gas station. She was watching us. We were getting gas, so we start rattling off numbers. And then I see she's kind of writing them down, and I see across the top of what she's writing down, lotto, and that she is basically having us gamble with her. And of course, to her, she was not a member.
Okay.
My dad is a convert to the church. So to her, she's just kind of playing a silly game with her grandkids. But to us, she was having us commit a cardinal sin.
Oh my
and
gosh.
I remember my sister and me talked about it, and we were kind of going back and forth if we're going to tell our parents. And she finally told our parents, and it was this huge blow up within the family. And that's just one example of all we did as children to participate was just saying a few numbers. But I have carried guilt from that basically through my whole life, not just because now I'm not guilty about the gambling part, but just the way that impacted, the deep impact that had on my family dynamic is just one example of how deep seated the religion was within our family.
Yeah, I think that's something really important to point out because it's something that's so silly. And when people are like, Mormonism's not a cult, if you really look at the levels of mind control and the levels of manipulation and coercion and guilt and shame, it really does check all the boxes. Because when you have something as simple as just feeling guilty for helping grandma gamble, how it completely impacted your childhood, it really just goes to show how ingrained this doctrine is, whether or not it's something extremely problematic, whether or not it's a huge, quote, sin, it still has the same amount of impact. And that's why it can be so dangerous, because you're working with children here who are feeling like the worst person on the planet for just rattling off numbers. I feel like it can be even more dangerous psychologically when it's something so benign that you're teaching a child to feel guilt and shame over.
And I had so much apprehension spending time with my grandparents because they were not members of the church. And as a young Mormon kid, you're definitely taught a distrust for anyone who's not a member. So no sleepovers with anyone who was not a member. If I had friends that weren't members, which I grew up in Montana and Texas and Kentucky primarily, and none of those are deeply Mormon states. And I was always very much pushed to have friendships and close relationships with only the members of the church. And even within my own family, my grandma smoked cigarettes and she drank coffee. And the way that alienated me from her is very sad. And she recently passed away. And I feel so sad that for my entire childhood, I had a deep distrust of my own grandma, who was babysitting me, giving me little birthday presents and just loving on me, and just feeling like there was this massive wall up between her and I and my grandpa too, because she was sinning in front of me, smoking, drinking coffee. And I feel like that's just one almost little microcosm of an example of how this church kind of in every little facet of my life took hold and took hold of the way that I was just even perceiving the world around me.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I remember something similar. I had a very, very, very devout grandma, and grandpa drank coffee. And whenever we would have sleepovers, he would have his morning coffee. And I remember being like, oh, grandpa's having coffee. And she would be like, don't do that in front of the kids. And so it's so funny because don't do what in front of the kids? Like drink a beverage. It's not that big of a deal, but they make it out to be such a big deal and a big sin that now us as kids are like, oh my gosh, grandpa is such a sinner, but he's not. He's just drinking coffee. So all of these things, I feel like the way that your family raised you and how devout you were, and especially because I've lived in other places besides Utah as well as a Mormon, so I understand the different dynamics of when you live in a state where it's not Mormon majority, you have to be an example and you have to do better and you have to kind of rise above all the things, do the rules a little bit better. At least that was my experience. And so do you think why you were kind of pushing yourself to go to BYU, where you could just be amongst the Mormons and not have to worry about having friends who are non-Mormon?
Yeah, I think that BYU, really Provo and Utah in general, was always held up as this kind of I always think of it as the Mormon Mecca,
Yeah.
where we would visit occasionally because we had family there on my mom's side, and every time we were there's temples all over the place and chapels, and every single person I would interact with was Mormon, and it just felt like I wanted to live there so badly because I wanted to be part of Zion. You know, it's also called Zion, which is the most perfect place on the planet. And so when I was going through high school and considering where I could apply, I got some scholarships to a few places. I actually got offered a scholarship for running, and I've always loved running, and none of it held a candle to BYU because all of these other dreams I had were just so inconsequential in comparison to my desire to walk the straight and narrow path. And to me, I perceived that would be BYU. And that was also where I was going to find a righteous husband. And even, there's all within the church, there's all this conversation about the differences between BYU Provo and BYU Hawaii and BYU Idaho. And Idaho is always looked down upon as like the inferior school. And so I feel like so much of my academic dream was just to try to get a good enough GPA. BYU Provo, I believe, is the hardest to get into. At least it was when I was going and trying to apply. And so everything I did was basically in pursuit of trying to get into that school. And even when I got that running scholarship, I was intrigued, but still ultimately just couldn't care less about that opportunity because I just wanted to go live in Utah. I wanted to date Mormon boys and get married in a Mormon temple. And I felt like it was so much of my childhood is just any time that the church had this kind of opportunity placed in front of me or this path presented for me, I always did everything in my power to get on that path rather than chase any of these other dreams. And so my dad had given me a blessing my senior year of high school to say that I would be an English teacher. And so I got that acceptance letter to BYU. I have these pictures where I made BYU cookies and I was wearing my BYU shirt and decked out in my BYU gear. And I was definitely all in on trying to be the best Mormon person, best Mormon girl I could. And the first week of school, I signed up for my major to be in English education, even though I had so many other dreams and talents and passions, so many other career paths I could have pursued. But instead of being a writer or going into a scientific field or doing photography or any of these other, I probably could have even loved videography, which is kind of what I'm apparently doing now with my life. But I threw all of that in the trash and said, my dad gave me a blessing. And in the Mormon religion, a blessing is not actually from your dad or whoever happens to be the one speaking the words. A blessing is from God with a capital G. So to me, it felt that I felt I had a mandate from God himself to become an English teacher and to go to BYU and to find a husband. And it all felt like this path was kind of coming together for me when I got that acceptance letter. And I started walking, without ever looking in any sort of direction or asking myself, is this really what I want? Is this the best path for me? As a member, you don't ever ask any of those questions. You just, once you're on that path and once you kind of have a direction from a priesthood leader, from a prayer,
patriarchal blessing,
that's what you do.
Yeah. I was so close to going to BYU. I remember telling my mom, I've told this story before, but it seems very relevant now. I remember moving to Oregon from Utah my senior year of high school, and I was like, okay, I got to go back to Utah. I got to go to BYU so that I can find a husband who I actually like, because now that I've been out of the state, slim pickings with Mormons out here, and I want to make sure I have like a lot of men to choose from, and they're probably going to be returned missionaries. And so I need to go to BYU. And my mom's like, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, Mom. And then I ended up going to Vegas, and then she's like, wait, are you sure you want to go to Vegas? So I kind of like did a rug pull on her, but I was very close to going to BYU. So let's talk about why it's such a big deal to go to BYU. It's Brigham Young University, named after the second most awful prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And there are so many rules. If you could, Alyssa, just bless us with a few of the ridiculous rules when you go to BYU.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when you are raised Mormon, the rules are, you're just a fish in water. You're so used to the rules by that point, about from anything from modesty to, they didn't even have caffeine on campus. Of course they didn't have coffee, but they didn't even have caffeine on campus when I went there. No even buying a glass of Coca-Cola or whatever. But so there's so many rules, but for a squeaky clean Mormon kid, it doesn't feel like there are rules because the rules are what you've already been raised to be in. But for the average outsider, it is a hyper strict school. So no drinking, of course, even no drinking. I never even attended a party where there was a single beverage, beer, alcohol, nothing. It's one of the driest campuses, rated driest campus in the country. The modesty rules are very strict. There's a whole guideline around what you can wear. For women, it's no tank tops, no shorts. At BYU Idaho, for a very long time, you weren't even allowed to wear leggings or any type of short. So BYU Idaho had even a stricter dress code, and they call it the Lord's University, which is why everyone wants to go there, because it's literally God's campus,
Yeah.
And so other rules would be, men aren't permitted to have beards. They can have mustaches, but no beards.
They can't even take a test if they have a beard. I've heard stories of people who are like, I went to go take my exam and they wouldn't let me in until I went home and shaved and came back.
Yeah. Some people ask, how do they implement these rules so effectively? And it's because there's something called the testing center. And most of the courses you take have a test, which is administered in the testing center. And to go and take your test, they do like a check. They check your face, your hair, your body, and they check to make sure you're living all of the, outward standards. So for girls, like at one point I had a little streak of red hair, and anytime I would go to the testing center, I'd put my hair in a ponytail because I would not be able to take my test if they saw that I had the red hair. So piercing, same thing. If you showed up with a piercing, you would have to take it out. For men, some men, if they grow a beard faster, like their stubble grows too quickly, they will bring a razor so that they can shave right before their test, just to ensure they're going to be able to take the test and not have any issues. So that's kind of the catch-all for at least the physical, the rules around dress and appearance is the testing center. And then of course the professors might check, people around the campus might check. Sometimes I've heard the librarians will approach someone and say, hey, your skirt is too short, or you're not within the dress code right now. You'll get dress coded in college, which is kind of insane.
Yeah.
And no gay or homosexual sexual affection of any kind. So it's not even just that, gay people can't get married. Of course, that's a rule. But in addition, no touching of any kind, no hand holding, kiss on the cheek. You're not permitted to show affection of any kind as a gay person. You're supposed to be not just sexually celibate, but physically, no physical affection at all is permitted. So that's another rule. I have a whole video about all the rules because it's honestly it's very difficult to even express all the rules because there's such a long list.
Yeah. I think some of my favorites that I've heard over the years is not being able to cross the threshold of the opposite sex when you're in their apartment, which has to be sanctioned by BYU because they're like laid out a certain way. You can only be in the living room. You can't go into the hallway. Yeah, you can't go to the hallway that goes to the bedrooms, and you have to leave their apartment by midnight. So people would just like sit at their front doors and have conversations. So the guy wasn't actually in their apartment, but they're still hanging out past midnight.
Yeah, and that's one of the loopholes that gets used at BYU is that at I think it's 12. I think for me it was 11. I'd have to look it up what the time is more recently, but people, when they get kicked out of the dorms, they will go to the parks. And so whenever I was at BYU, people would have those old little DVD players, and they'd bring their little CD, and we'd go to the park and everyone would gather around, almost like one of those things you take into a car and watch the movie together.
Oh
and
my
so
gosh.
You just can't be inside in the dorms, but people will kind of break the rules by going to the parks, or another very common one is going to cars. So people will go drive around, find a parking lot, make out in the parking lot or whatever. And that's also super common. If you go, if you're in Utah and you go up to any mountain around BYU, there's the main Y mountain, and go to the parking lot. The joke is that all the windows are going to be steamy because everybody had to flee from their housing and go in the car. And especially when it's really cold out, you can't go to the park because Utah is cold much of the year. So then everybody's in their car, and it's a very silly loophole, but it's, college kids are usually at the age where they want to pair off and go be romantic with each other. So it's very normal, but it creates an environment of people doing some really strange, odd things when you can't even cross the threshold into someone's bedroom at all if you're the opposite sex.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been getting on videos that we do about BYU, people are just like, okay, well then don't go. Like if it's so bad, don't go to BYU. Can you just explain, Alyssa, and we've kind of touched on it, but why you're kind of coerced into going to this school? Why it is such a big honor to go to this school? Why, if you're a Mormon, it's like where you go, and why you don't really have much of a choice if you're doing all the right Mormon things?
Yeah, I think people who say that don't quite realize what it is to grow up in a religion like Mormonism, because when you go to college, you're 18 typically, and you're going straight from your hyper-religious family, and you are going straight to college, or you go from your hyper-religious family to your Mormon mission, which is also hyper-religious, and then to college. So you've basically never had an experience outside of your faith, and then you're in college. And then once you're in college, that's kind of your first time living alone, living with roommates or, whatever. And once you're there, a lot of people do start questioning the life that they've just kind of been handed on a platter by their parents, and saying, maybe I do have questions about church history. Maybe I do have questions about, questioning the fundamental premise of this religion, of what a woman is supposed to do, of what a man is supposed to do. And once you're that far in, though, into the college, your degree is completely hanging over your head, because if you get kicked out, if you break the rules, if you lose, as part of going to BYU, you have to have an ecclesiastical endorsement. So your bishop basically has to say, spiritually, you're on the right path and you're living the rules. If you go against that, then they can revoke your degree and or basically not grant it. So for a lot of people, maybe they make it through the first couple years of BYU and they're totally on board with the program. But once they're halfway through their degree, and keep in mind, it's pretty hard to transfer credits. Maybe they could transfer only 50% of their general education credits. BYU has also a ton of religious credits, so you can't transfer religious credits. Then by the time you're questioning your testimony, you're basically so far into your degree that to not finish the degree is to give up a year of money and time you've already spent to get the degree. Everyone knows transferring schools is pretty difficult and time consuming. And so most people, unfortunately, will just have to silently put up with the rules and lie and pretend until they can get that degree in hand, which is why it's so crazy. Every time graduation rolls around, there's a whole spate of people who come out as leaving the church after they get that degree, because you are not really allowed to be outspoken against the church, break the rules, have coffee, do all of these little things. So you'll see people who say, hey, I just graduated BYU, I'm gay, and I'm leaving the church. But they have to wait until they get that degree in hand, because if they do it before they get the degree, I know people personally who had their degree taken and revoked, and they had a semester left. And so now they're just degreeless. They don't have a degree at all because they weren't able to basically transfer that over, and they lost 4 years of their life, essentially.
That's so awful. The fact that they can just take it away or kick you out at any point, because there's something like the honor code and the honor code office where people they're encouraged to snitch on each other. And isn't it a rule? This is what I heard, that let's say, Alyssa, you had a boy over past midnight and your roommate didn't snitch on you, and the honor code found out that your roommate knew and didn't snitch, she could also be in trouble.
Yeah, it's definitely such a culture of surveillance, and they have, very easy to find on the BYU website, a form that you can fill out. You can submit it anonymously. So sometimes people will just, out of anger or hate or spitefulness, they'll submit reports about people who they have no claim necessarily for their allegations, but you can submit things anonymously and they'll probably investigate it depending on the claim. So it's definitely it's very big brother to go there, because you can get someone snitching on you for your roommate could do it, your professor could do it, someone in church. So often too, the crazy part is that the BYU police, the BYU University, the Provo City Police, and the religion, Mormonism, your bishop, your ecclesiastical leader will all have fluid communication. So there's been cases where girls will go and say to law enforcement, hey, I was raped or I was sexually assaulted. And then that law enforcement will call and tell the bishop, or if she tells her bishop, then the bishop will let the professors know. And the way the communication is streamlined, it makes it so that basically all of these people, I think they've, quote, gotten better now. I mean, I don't know if I believe that it's better. They've just said they've gotten better. But all the communication is very streamlined. So there's not a lot of anonymity. Even if you tell one part of the organization, that part could reach out to other parts of the organization. And, suddenly, because you said you were sexually assaulted to law enforcement, you're in the BYU Honor Code office because you allowed a boy in your dorm room past midnight. So it really silences victims, because if you were sinning when you got assaulted, sinning being
it's your
boy
fault
in your room, then you could then be under investigation for breaking the honor code.
It's so awful. So then what was your experience like? Did you have any standout moments that kind of shaped your college experience?
I think, like I said, I was fairly, I think the red hair that I mentioned was one of the worst things I did. Going to BYU. I know, very disobedient. I have memories of, kind of butting heads with people about certain things. I never had any issues with the honor code office specifically. But I have memories of so many conversations. I remember once talking to a group of friends, there were some guys there as well, about how I thought tattoos looked cool. And one of the guys basically accused me of not having a testimony of the prophet, because I was like, well, I might get a tattoo, or like, I think it'd be cool to get a tattoo. And I do have tattoos now. You can't see from the shirt. But this guy basically said, do you not then believe that what the prophet has revealed about tattoos is true? And I said, well, I think it's true, but I think basically I was kind of trying to say, I don't think it's that big of a deal to get a tattoo. And he essentially just said, you don't have a testimony, and your body is a temple, and you wouldn't put a bumper sticker on a luxury car, and all of the things people always say about tattoos in the church and out of the church too. But I'd had a lot of conversations like that where there would be, people would be talking about how apparently everyone always said all these buildings on campus are named after men. Almost every single building on that campus is named after a man. And they would always make jokes that the reason that the dorms that the girls would stay in, there's one specific group of dorms that have kitchens, and those dorms are named after women. And so everyone would always joke that the reason that those buildings got names is because women are supposed to be in the kitchen.
Yikes.
That's just kind of like my story with my grandma. That's, I could pull these out of the hat for indefinitely, essentially, because these are the conversations that are happening basically all the time at BYU, enforcing gender roles, enforcing the church as being the one true church, and discouraging questions. And it's very claustrophobic in some ways, but anytime I would feel dissonant with what the organization was wanting me to feel or believe, I would just feel very guilty. I wouldn't feel, oh, I'm leaving this place because I believe that I'm right. I would feel really bad for not having sufficient faith to meet the expectations that my religion was asking me to be able to meet. And so I think at that point I was still enough of a believer that if I felt like something was happening that was wrong or that I didn't believe in, I would just feel like I was the one that was broken, and I was the one that needed to fix myself in order to be able to have enough faith to believe in what was happening.
Well, that's what they teach you. It's never you that's the problem. It's you, or it's never them that's the problem. It's you that's the problem. And they teach you that, like, oh, search, ponder, and pray. But if you don't get the right answer, search, ponder, and pray again until you do, because it's always something that you're doing wrong. You need to pray harder or read your scriptures more. It's interesting that in a church that's apparently full of accountability, of like, you always have to go and confess your sins to a bishop, and you have to be accountable and repent and all this stuff. They never do that. They never say, oh, sorry, like, plot twist, they don't care about tattoos anymore. But we're never going to apologize to all the people who we wouldn't let go to the temple because they had a tattoo. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think I did meet people from time to time. There were some professors or some people who were there who would kind of open my eyes. I had one friend who was gay, and I remember him he transferred halfway through his degree. And after he transferred, he had this big post about being gay and how he felt that his community had failed him. And I was pretty close to him, but I didn't know he was gay. And I remember just feeling so awful for not standing up for him or not being able to be there for him in the way that he obviously needed. And he had, I think, shared a bit about being suicidal at different points, and how nobody, everybody says they're so righteous and living in the Lord's way, but nobody can even give an ounce of care and love to this person who's struggling. And so, that's an example of a moment where, while I'm even still at BYU and believing, just feeling like, I feel like even though I'm being told I'm so righteous and good for believing these things, I'm seeing that by their fruits ye shall know them, the outcome of this belief is actually very damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. A very toxic environment. And you decided that wasn't enough. You wanted to go and double down and go to a mission. So what's the thought process there? What made you decide? Because especially as women, I remember growing up, I don't know, I think we're close to the same age, but I remember hearing the message of, ladies, your goal is not to go on a mission because we want you to get married. And that's why it was 21 before women could go, and it was 19 before boys could go. And it was like, all right, if you're not married by 21, I guess you can go on a mission. But then they lowered it to 20, and that's when you went. So what was it that made you feel like you wanted to serve a mission?
Yeah, they lowered it to 19 when I was attending BYU.
Oh,
and
19 for girls. They lowered it to, and then 18 for boys.
Yeah, 18 for boys, 19 for girls. And, I think in the same way, the priesthood, only boys can have the priesthood, which is the power of God. Girls can't, women can't. And the priesthood was so held up all throughout my life as this amazing, powerful thing that only men could have. And I think that the missions were kind of an extension of that, where boys were told, you get to go out and serve the Lord. That's going to be the best 2 years. This is how you kind of prove your worthiness. And girls, it was very much an afterthought. So for boys, it's basically a direct commandment from God to serve a mission. Whereas for girls, it's more like, if you want to and you're not married, like you said.
Yeah.
And so when they changed the rule, I think to me, it felt like, even though I wouldn't be able to have the priesthood, maybe it was easier for me to access this thing that only boys and men had been able to achieve spiritually prior to the age change. So I think that growing up and seeing boys be told this is super important and you should do it, and then feeling like maybe I also get to have some of that call from God, I think that was really exciting to me, because it felt like maybe I was kind of being elevated to be as important to the church as the men had always been to some extent. And then too, my older sister had served a mission, and I think just seeing her and reading her letters and talking about, how much she was loving it, and I think I just, in the same way that I had always wanted to be on this path, at that point I still was loving being Mormon and had a very strong testimony. And it just felt like when they changed the age, I was in a BYU dorm room when they changed the age for girls, and you could hear screams around you, from upstairs, roommates, girls were going in the street and like, we can serve missions now. Or not that they couldn't, we can serve missions now instead of having to wait for 3 years after leaving home. Now we just have to wait till we're 19. That's a pretty big difference. So I think also they called it the wave at the time. There's a wave of girls who wanted to go serve missions. And so I think I was caught up in that to some extent. And there started to be guys, girls were always told you shouldn't marry a man unless he served a mission. And then guys started saying, well, I don't want to marry a girl unless she served a mission. So
really?
I think it became this like spiritual one-upsmanship, which happens a lot in Mormonism, where, you went to BYU, but did you serve a mission? You served a mission, but were you AP? You were AP, but how many baptisms did you get? So there's always all these metrics for calculating just how Mormon someone is. And I think that to me, serving a mission was one way that I could show my level of commitment, was to go and do this thing for 24 hours, 7 days a week, and never seeing my family. And so I think I just got swept up in that. And I think I did sincerely want to go. It wasn't coercion at that point. I think I still just so thoroughly believed that it was the truth of God that I felt like it was the right thing to do.
So that's a really interesting statement right there. You said, I don't think it was coercion, but I thought it was the right thing to do. I'm just going to play devil's advocate because that's what we do here. Don't you feel like because you were indoctrinated from birth to believe that this was the one true church, to believe that you needed to be righteous, you needed to prove yourself, prove your worthiness, you needed to serve God in every facet of your life, don't you think that counts as a little bit of coercion into giving your life away for 1.5 years for full-time service to the Lord?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think when you think of someone coercion, you'd think of maybe a single person.
Of course. Yeah.
Who sits you down, and that's, I think, why it's so sneaky, the way the church gets people to do things, is that you don't perceive you're being coerced because there's never a moment where someone sits you down and says, you have to do this.
Yeah.
But instead, you just see mirrored all throughout your life through indoctrination that these people are the best best people. These are the truest followers of Christ. So the coercion it's a very soft and subtle coercion. Well, it's not that soft or subtle. It's less subtle than someone screaming in your face, but
it's less perceivable. I call it the illusion of choice, because everyone says, no, I chose to go to BYU. I chose to serve a mission. I chose to live the commandments. But did you? Because the opposite of that is either not being with your family for eternity, or going to outer darkness, or going to a lower level of heaven, or being punished within like this life, right? Not taking the sacrament, not being able to pray in church, being excommunicated. There are so many consequences of not choosing the quote right thing, that did you really have a choice because you're choosing what you think is the path of least resistance? I don't know. It's tricky, and we could go on and on about this for days, and we have other things to get to. But I just wanted to point that out, that yes, you chose it and you thought it was the right thing to do, but it's also because, and you know this, is because of all of the manipulation and coercion that happened prior to that moment of you being like, yes, I will be the valiant one. So let's talk about your mission. I think there's a standout moment in your video you put out on your channel, which has like over 700,000 views. The moment where you're like, this is where I'm going to be called to go. And for those who aren't familiar with Mormon missions, you submit your paperwork after you get your worthiness, right? Your bishop has to say you're worthy enough to go. So that means you can't be fooling around with boys or girls if you're a guy. No premarital sex of any kind, no touching, like no extended kissing, making sure that you're following the word of wisdom. So no alcohol, no coffee drinking, all of these like little rules. When the bishop says, yes, you can go, submit your paperwork, and then the higher ups send out the call, and it's like this huge party. Everyone usually throws a party, and you open the letter together like, sister missionary, this is where you are called to go and serve. So you don't have any choice in the matter. People go all over the world, learn second languages, and do all this fun stuff. Usually, sometimes. But other times you get called to places that you're like, really? That's where I'm going? And so I thought it was really interesting, the moment when you thought you knew for sure where you were going to be called to.
Yeah, and this is kind of in the same way that all of these things are so hyped up within the community. Getting a mission call is very hyped up. Usually you have some sort of a big gathering, there's a party of some kind, maybe everybody comes over to your house, you open the letter, it's this kind of big show and tell moment. And so I was so excited to get my mission call, and I'll send you a picture if you want to include it here of me holding my mission call, looking so excited, huge smile on my face at my BYU dorm. And I had decided that I wanted to go on a hike and open it alone, because of course I was feeling like, oh, I'll be so much even more spiritual of a moment if I'm just alone and I can pray about it and all these things. And I hadn't been able to go on a mission initially because I had been having some mental health issues. So my bishop said that I needed to get cleared by a psychologist first, my therapist. And so it was very hard for me because I wanted to go right away, just like all the other women were doing, but instead I had to wait. And so it was doing baptisms for the dead ones, which is where you're baptized in the place of other people's souls who have passed away. And as I was waiting for my turn to go into the font, I hadn't even really been thinking about serving a mission in that particular moment. But as I was sitting there, I had this really strong feeling, almost like a voice telling me that I was going to serve my mission in Italy. And I remember just tearing up, and I started to cry because I felt like this moment of a revelation. I was crying so much that I actually even just left the temple, and I went home and I wrote in my journal, and I said, I received a revelation that I'm going to serve my mission in Italy, and I know I'll serve my mission in Italy as sure as I know God lives. And that's how powerful of an emotion it was, that basically this feeling that I just felt is the same feeling I've used to prove that Joseph Smith was a prophet, the Book of Mormon is the word of God, and that Jesus Christ died for me and my sins.
Conviction.
And so, and it almost felt like I was writing my script, like scriptures of old, like writing my testimony in my journal. And so when I finally got my mission call, maybe 3 or 4 months later, it felt like I had this little secret, that nobody else knew.
Yeah.
And I felt like I already know where I'm going to serve my mission. And it was almost like the same level of bravado that I bring to the church when I'm saying, I know the church is true beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I'm just like, I know I'm going to serve my mission in Italy beyond a shadow of a doubt. And so I go up on my hike, I get to where I'm going to open the mission call, and I open the letter, and it says, Sister Grenfell, you are hereby called to serve a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Denver, Colorado.
Wah, wah, wah.
And I remember just staring at it and feeling like,
wait, what?
Like such a gut punch, honestly.
Yeah.
And such a moment where I felt like I thought I heard the voice of God tell me I would serve a mission in Italy. And the paper says Denver, Colorado. And it was awful.
Yeah, especially because you got this revelation in the temple, right? So that's even more like you go to the temple. So because she hadn't gone on her mission yet, she wouldn't have had the clearance to go to the other parts of the temple where we've talked about this before. We did a whole episode with my mom and like what actually happens in the temple. But when you do baptisms for the dead, that's like the closest you can get to being, I don't know, in God's house, because you're there getting baptized for dead people. So the fact that you got this in the temple is also, you're just like, oh, well, obviously this is true. So I can only imagine that feeling when you realized it wasn't. Kind of like how the feeling that we felt when we're like, oh, the church is a lie. I feel like it would be somewhat similar. You're like, wait a second.
Yeah, it really felt like, and that was kind of just one example. I think that was the first major example of, and you hear so many stories growing up of people getting revelatory experiences like this. You hear so many, Joseph Smith saw God in Jesus Christ himself. Yeah. The Book of Mormon is filled with miracles that are very revelatory. And so when you're raised on this narrative of literal, from God's mouth to your ear revelation, it feels like it can happen to you too. And so I just fully believed that I had a Book of Mormon level, revelatory experience, and that that testimony that I got, in the temple, it says, "Holiness to the Lord, house of the Lord." So it's literally God's house. How can you get false revelation in God's house? And it was very hard for me to process at the time.
Yeah. So then you have to pretend to be super excited, or were you excited still?
By the time, I thought a lot about the moments after I got my mission call. And by the time, I hiked down off the mountain, I had completely dismissed this experience. I had completely dismissed that temple revelation. And I just felt like, as I had practiced doing before, I just told myself I was wrong. Because the church cannot be wrong, I'm wrong. And because the prophets obviously are closer to God than me, because the prophets decided for me to go to Denver, Colorado, I will go to Denver, Colorado. And so it felt like it was impossible for me in those moments to think outside of the box almost and say, well, something must be wrong then, with this entire system. I think I just forced my brain to go back into that place that said, if this is what I receive from the church, then that is more important and more powerful and more true than anything I could ever come up with by myself.
Yeah, and that's really all the best you can do, right? When you're in that situation of deciding if your personal revelation was true or if the church is true, it's always going to be the church. Like I was saying earlier, search, ponder, and pray, but if you don't get the answer that they want you to have, then you're just doing it wrong. So, because I remember having experiences like that where I'm like, that doesn't sound right. I'll pray about it. Oh, but that's not quite what they want me to believe. The church obviously is true. All these other people believe it. I'm the issue. So you go on your mission. Actually, was there any moment that you want to talk about your first temple experience? Is there anything that you're like, oh, I need to share this because it was crazy to me?
Yeah. I mean, that was another huge kind of dent in the chain of armor I feel like I had made for myself, my Mormon chain of armor of belief, because growing up, I had pictures of, I think there was even a conference talk where they said you should have a picture of a temple in every room. And so growing up, we had a picture of a temple in every single room, including my bedroom. I had all these little postcards of temples, and we would always, and anytime we would go on vacation, we would always go to the temple in that city where we were on vacation and walk around the grounds. And it was so hyped up, basically, to the level that I felt like it was going to be the most spiritual and special experience of my life. And I think when it's that amped up, as kind of, it's not just going to be like this ho-hum moment, it will be the best moment of your life to go through the temple. And you have a temple prep class, but they're basically like, well, we can't really tell you anything that happens in the temple, so it's not helpful. And so my first time going through, I don't know if I really knew what to expect at all. I think I just felt like I think the only thing I expected was that it was going to be the best moment of my life. And so when I first went through, I did the washing and anointing. And that was, I like in the washing and anointing, women put their hands on your head. And I mentioned earlier how I always wanted the priesthood. So that felt cool. And I think if I had just stuck with washing and anointing, maybe I would have been able to kind of been okay with it. But even that is very strange. They wash your loins. They don't literally wash your loins. They say, I wash your loins, but they've just put water on your head. Just to clarify, they used to wash your loins, which is why they say the words, but they've now changed the actions that go with the words to be less invasive. And then I got my garments on for the first time. And then I went through the temple endowment, which I think, when you first enter, there's this loud voice, or at least when I went, a loud voice that says, if you don't want to make the promises that you'll be asked to make today, you need to leave now.
But you don't know what those are.
But they don't disclose what the promises will be. And it's just a very foreboding way to start. And then they have the handshakes and all the clothing, the veil, the apron, the green apron, the robes of the priesthood. And I think each moment that passed as I get further and further into the ceremony, it's just my cortisol levels rise. And I just felt like more and more overwhelmed and stressed and anxious the further we got into the ceremony. Basically, maybe 2/3 of the way through, you do the prayer circle where you say, "Oh God, hear the words of my mouth" 3 times, and you're supposed to hold the hand of the person next to you, which is a man. And it's just such an alien experience when compared with the rest of Mormonism, which is fairly passable, at least in my opinion, to like any other Christian church. Especially as a kid, you just feel like, oh, we're just Christianity plus the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon's about Jesus anyways. But going through it, and then, you have to stand at the veil, and you basically get a hug, essentially, because the man on the other side of the veil, who you can't see, puts his arm around you, and you put your arm around him in basically an embrace. And then you say the magic code words, basically, to get through the veil. And I mean, going from having no knowledge at all about what happened in the temple to realizing it's a very strange cult-like ceremony with clothing, handshakes, code words, etc., holding, being hugged by a man through a veil that you don't know. Like it was such a slap in the face to me. And you're going through with your parents, or at least I did. Both my parents were and are still fully endowed, active members of the church. And I just remember looking at both my parents and feeling just betrayed, honestly. Like,
you've been doing this the whole time, and you didn't tell me.
You've been doing this the whole time. How could you have led me into this? Feeling like this is what you've trained. This is the culmination of my entire religious experience. This is what you've led me to do. And I remember getting home and getting undressed for my shower, and I had my 2 bags of the garments, ready to put on after my shower, because part of going to the temple is promising that for the rest of your life, you're going to wear garments.
Which is for those who aren't familiar, an undershirt and biker shorts that replace regular underwear, and you're supposed to put your bra on the outside. Or did they change it by the time you went?
I was instructed to put my bra on over the garment,
right.
Basically. So there's symbols on the garments. It's like a compass and a square and a ruler after Masonry, but they don't tell you it's after Masonry.
Yeah,
I was told to put them as close to your body as possible. So for most women who would have gone through it the time I did, or earlier than I did, you would have put the garment top on and then your bra over the garments. And same with underwear. Most women would only wear panties, like underwear, during their period, and otherwise you're just wearing the garments as your replacement for your underwear.
Oh, my mom was not allowed to wear underwear in addition to the garments.
Wow.
So I remember her telling me like, I hate this when I'm on my period. It's so awful, which it would be.
Yeah, and they've really, any time that there's an issue people have with the temple, they really quietly and kind of as sneakily as possible, they get rid of it. So after I went through, they stopped telling women to have their garments underneath their bras. They've stopped, talking about how to approach a period as a endowed woman. Now they just say, I'm sure they don't give any instruction. They just leave it to the individual, which often means then either girls are doing it according to how their mom taught them, or just doing it according to whatever they think they should be doing without any direction at all. So it means everybody's just kind of scrounging around in the dark, not really understanding what the expectation is, which does lead to a lot of confusion.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. You were showering and you're about to put your garments back on.
Yes. So as I stepped out of the shower, I had my towel on, and I just remember sitting and staring at the bag and the 2, plastic baggies that the garments were in, the top and the bottom. And I felt so disgusting inside. And I felt like I did not believe that whatever had happened to me in the temple was a great spiritual experience. I did not have any sort of spiritual witness at all that was good or righteous or holy. I just felt completely put off by the entire thing, disgusted, repulsed. And so, the garments are meant to symbolize the promises that you've made in the temple. And so I'm staring at these 2 bags and knowing I now for the rest of my life have to wear 24/7, night and day, a representation of what just happened to me. And the psychological weight of knowing that I was going to have to wear these garments for the rest of my life, and that this was the moment. It was almost like I had never worn them before. Today was the first day I was going to start wearing them. And it was like, I just wanted to say, I'm not even going to do it. And I'm just going to, I'm going to walk away. But then the manipulation is that typically when you get your endowment, when you do that ceremony, it's a week or 2 before your Mormon wedding or your Mormon mission. And so to say, I'm not doing this, I'm going to walk away, is to also walk away from your mission, which you've put off school, you've told everyone you're going, you've been even excited to go. I was excited to go. And so you can't reject your endowment without rejecting the mission you've already committed to go on, or your wedding.
Yeah.
So I hate the fact that it's timed that way. And I think that had I not already been committed to serve a mission, maybe I would have left at that point, because I hated the temple so much. But because the gravity of my Mormon mission was pulling me forward, I shoved the feeling down all over again. And I just said, all right, I'm putting the garments on. And I put them on, and I ended up wearing them for about 4 years. Every day, every night, just like I had been asked to do.
Yeah. And I've never really considered the timing, like you just said, because you can't, generally speaking, you can't just go to a bishop and say, hey, I want to go to the temple now. Usually it's right before you get married or right before your mission. And so the way that it's timed, like you were saying, it's so manipulative into keeping you, because if you just would have went at any time, maybe people would just be like, no, I'm not doing this. This is weird. Why did I sign up for this? But they kind of force you into compliance by hanging these huge milestones over your head that you've been working towards your entire life. And if you didn't go on your mission, everyone would probably just assume you had sex with somebody.
So true. Yeah. And I think people too, like, you know, I've heard a lot of women say that they get their endowment right before they get married. And so many women say that they hated it and they were crying and they, you know, had a breakdown afterwards and said, I don't like this. I don't want to wear a representation of whatever that ceremony just was. Mm-hmm. And to reject the endowment would mean, you know, think of how much planning goes into a wedding. You've booked potentially a venue, you have your wedding dress, everybody already bought plane tickets to come out and see you get married. And so to say, I'm not going to go through with this endowment thing, I'm not going to wear my garments, is basically calling off your wedding, which, as you said, if you do that, everyone just thinks you had sex. Yeah. So it's basically, you're kind of doubly forced into just accepting that the temple is A-okay with you because you go through it. You've already kind of pre-made the promises, and then you have this other milestone that's very public that you can't pull out of very easily at all.
Yep. So you go on this mission, you put on the garments. What was it like for you? Can you explain, I guess, kind of some of the rules for female missionaries? I guess it wouldn't be different than men, but I've only ever talked to one other female missionary on here, actually two, my cousin and Irene's Entropy, but I want to hear from you what it was like, some of the rules that you had to live by.
Yeah, I think the hardest rule for me is just the no contact rule. And they've actually, it is better now the way that they've, you know, when I went through, you were not allowed to talk to your family anytime other than emailing once a week on Mondays. Mm-hmm. And besides that, emailing, you don't, you know, you have a cell phone, but it's not your cell phone. It's the church's cell phone. It's the mission's cell phone. So you don't have anyone's phone number that you're even allowed to, even if you had it memorized, you wouldn't be allowed to put it in and start texting your mom or something. So you can only email once a week. And then other than that, when I went, the rule was that you can have one phone call on Christmas Day and then one phone call on Mother's Day. And during that phone call, your companion has to be with you. So you can't even just say, oh, I have a moment alone with my family to have this phone call. Your companion is sitting next to you. At least, you know, for us, our instruction was not that even that the phone calls can be happening at the same time. It's that the companion is listening as she's just sitting there as you're on the phone call. So even I got to speak to my family twice in the year and a half that I served my mission. And for both times, my companion was right next to me, listening to every word that I said. So it wasn't a private phone call. Wow. So that was the hardest for me. There are lots and lots. There's a whole rule book. I swear I have it around here somewhere, but there's I had the white handbook. They've updated it. It's very similar though. You know, you're not allowed to watch or read or consume any media that's not church approved. So no novels. You couldn't read Harry Potter. You can't watch any movies. You can't listen to any secular music. If you listen to music, it has to be church music. If you read anything, it has to be church literature, Book of Mormon, Bible, that kind of a thing. And so everything you consume is just Mormon religious stuff. There's nothing outside of that, you know? So even if people had CDs that would have one Taylor Swift song on them, they might have their companion say, we need to throw that away. You also have a very strict schedule. So basically the schedule, you wake up at 6:30 and you essentially are working, you know, as far as doing things that you're being asked to do. You have 30 minutes for breakfast, 30 minutes for lunch, or an hour depending on your mission, and then an hour for dinner. So besides that, basically from 6:30 through 9:30, you are doing something that is, whether it's studying, knocking on doors, meeting with investigators, people who are interested in the church. And so and you don't even get a day off on Sunday, which is so ironic considering it's the
day
Sabbath
of rest.
Yeah. The day of rest. You'd think that they would let you have a day off on Sunday, but you're not permitted to have a day off on Sunday. Your only day off from the typical schedule is Monday, which is the only day you're allowed to do grocery shopping or get a haircut or do laundry. So it's not even technically a day off. It's basically a day to clean. And for my mission, we weren't permitted to spend more than a certain amount of time even doing those emails. So you can go to we went to the library, we would do our communication with our family, but I believe we were permitted about 1 hour for that communication. So it's not like you can be emailing back and forth with your family. It's that you are sending a letter to your mission president. You're quickly, maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs to a few friends or family members, and then you're kicked off the computer. So it's not even like your P day. Everybody says P day is your fun day, but it's really just a day to kind of get stuff done so that then you don't have to do laundry on a Wednesday when you're supposed to be out knocking on doors and trying to find people to teach.
So the thing that's wild to me about all of this is you're taking teenagers, you're throwing them like darts to a map anywhere in the world, but somehow, and you're giving them 30 minutes for breakfast, 30 minutes for lunch, an hour for dinner, and they are self-policing this schedule. Like, it blows my mind that it actually works, but then at the same time, I'm like, well, of course it works because they're so indoctrinated into following the rules, and if they don't, they think they're sinning. And so it's just wild that you can tell this teen, this is how much time you have allotted for your meal, and the rest of the time you are working. And it actually, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Are there people who were just like, screw it, I'm not doing this?
Yeah. So it's so funny that you mentioned that, because I feel like I remember in my mission was very rules oriented. Each mission has its own culture, which is kind of set by the mission president. There will be special rules or special kind of observances. Or for example, my sister served in Spain, and in Spain they have a siesta. So they would be out teaching till 10:30. So anyways, every mission is a little bit different, but we had this saying that we learned at the MTC and then was reiterated throughout my mission, which is that obedience brings blessings and exact obedience brings miracles. And so we would talk about how you're supposed to wake up at 6:30. And if you wake up at 6:31, that is disobedient. And basically that anyone waking up at 6:31 is telling the Lord that they are not willing to do what it takes in order to convert people to the church.
Yikes.
And so to your question about people who wouldn't follow the rules, the not following the rules was typically people who would do things like sleeping in. And, you hear that. I remember once everybody was gossiping about these elders who would sleep in till 7 a.m. and how, oh my gosh, I can't believe that that's the type of missionary that they are. And that when you have so many rules, that disobedience and sinning is sleeping in 30 minutes or even sleeping in 1 minute, that's brainwashing. That's mind control. Yeah. And so usually when we had people breaking the rules, it was these little tiny things that would then be put on blast for. And so it wasn't often that, they're dating people or they're watching rated R movies. Usually the sins or the disobedience are to these smaller little rules that most of us would think, oh, what's the difference in pressing snooze and sleeping until 6:35, but for us, that was a big deal.
Right. And I remember some propaganda that the church put out. In fact, I think I did a video with Nuanto Cara Burrell about it, and we actually played it. And it was a video that the church put together. There was a missionary who was going out, and maybe, I think it was like before his mission, he decided to go out with a girl, and things got a little too heated. And because of that decision, when he went on his mission, there was a convert, or a guy who was investigating, an investigator who didn't convert, because he wasn't worthy enough to be teaching him. And then it goes the reverse of like, oh, he said no to the girl, and then the guy joined the church. And so just the fact that they're putting this on teenagers, like your personal decisions will decide or change the fate of some random person that you come across. Like you have that power, I think is so damaging.
Yeah, you're basically taught that if you're not obedient, you're stealing salvation from other people, and that Jesus suffered for those people for nothing. So if I think I had some religious scrupulosity, especially on my mission, where, it's very difficult for a human being to be given a book of rules that is 80 or 90 pages long of fine print of rules, and to know that I have to follow every single rule in this handbook in order to get salvation to the people who need it the most and that the Lord would want to place in front of me. Mm-hmm. And even as a missionary, you're required to, on my mission, we read 3 pages of the White Handbook, the rule book, every single day, so that by the time you finish your mission, you basically have that rule book memorized because you've read it 100 or so times, because you're reading it so often and you're consulting it, you're looking at it. And even Preach My Gospel, which is the missionary, the guidebook for how to teach the lessons, even that has rules in it that aren't necessarily in the White Handbook. And so that's more rules that you should be, there's one that's about how you should be always looking for people to find. So my mission really pushed, even on your P day, even when you're getting gas, even when you are stopping and tying your shoe on the street, if you see someone, you should try to talk to them. So you're just never off.
Yeah.
If you are anywhere in public, you also have to wear your name tag all the time. So I would go up to people in Target or in Walmart and try to get them to talk to me. And now I'm like, I can't imagine if a missionary tried to evangelize to me while I'm shopping. I think I would lose it, because you'd think that that's the one place you're safe from like a salesperson approaching you while you're getting cereal. But yeah, so even that, talk to everyone is one of the rules. And so no matter where you are or what you're doing, if you see someone, there's this huge pressure to walk over to them and try to talk to them and give them a Book of Mormon.
Yeah. So you talked about scrupulosity, religious OCD, and just having to do everything or else you feel like a failure. You had mentioned earlier that you were delayed going on your mission because of mental health issues, and you don't have to elaborate on what those were, but I'm wondering how all of this did impact your mental health when you were out there in the field.
I think it just was a lot of guilt and a lot of anxiety. Guilt for, even having an unkind thought, or guilt for, even having someone cross us on the other side of the street and not walking over to go talk to them was an insane amount of guilt. And I've had especially just being raised the way I was, I've had so much guilt throughout my life. My grandma, the story with my grandma was just one example, but I think it was just so much psychological pressure all the time of this analysis, basically almost like a computer running a systems check to see like, what rules am I not following? What rules do I need to follow better? What rules can I be exactly obedient to? And that was kind of like the hamster wheel that my life was put on as a Mormon, but then even more strictly as a missionary. And I remember going and watching, my family, we went to go see a movie after I was back from my mission. And I remember during the movie, it was maybe I was home for a week, I just broke down into tears because I felt like my life had no meaning if I couldn't be living up to these rules, and if I wasn't calling people to come into Christ constantly. And I just felt so just empty inside because I just wanted those rules, because I had been building up my system so much to be following rules, that once those were kind of ripped out from underneath me, it felt like I had no ability to kind of be doing the right thing all the time. I had no ability to say, I'm a good person. It just felt like my life became completely, utterly meaningless after I was home because I no longer had the rules to grasp onto to prove to myself that I was a good person.
So I just want everyone to pause for a second and take that in, because earlier I was like, how do you get a teenager? How do you like put a teenager anywhere in the world and get them to follow these rules on their own? You have these rules so cemented in your head that, again, illusion of choice. You are so valiant and so worthy in your mind that when you got home, you missed that intense struggle, that intense rule following. You missed the schedule. And I feel like that's so important to talk about, because not only did they get you to follow them, they got you to miss that regime. That's wild.
And it's a very common thing that people realize about return missionaries, like return missionary syndrome, is that they're very weird. People will talk about that return missionaries will act really weird because you've been told not to even you can't have your own phone, no social media, no reading anything that isn't church approved. You've been so removed from normal life that just jumping back into it, most people have a really hard time reacclimating, because if once you've been told watching a movie is a sin, it's really hard to just start watching a movie again, especially after a year and a half for girls or 2 years for boys. It's like, that's so long to have trained yourself to be following this hyper strict religious schedule and expectations, that as soon as you're back, most people struggle with dating. They struggle with some people, I've heard of people becoming suicidal because they just were so, your brain was so trained to live in that reality that when it's torn out from under you, it feels like there's no meaning left for you to grasp onto when you're going from telling yourself you're a warrior for God,
right,
to then sitting in a movie theater with your family watching a PG-13 movie. The guilt is very significant, in my opinion.
Right. I feel like one of the best tactics to get these kids to implement these rules is to, like you said, tell them that they are a warrior for God. You are valiant. You are superior. You are the top of the food chain in Mormonism right now because you have donated your life, not donated, you have paid to go on this trip, and you have paid the church to market for them and to bring them more people. And I think one of the things we need to get into is the fact that even though you're paying the church to go on a mission, they still can't always provide housing that is adequate, or an allowance that is adequate for food, or living conditions that are healthy. So let's talk about your living conditions while you were out there.
Yeah. So in some missions, like my husband served his mission in Sweden. So most foreign countries, they rent apartments. So they'll rent you an apartment. So you actually have your own living space. But in the States, to save money for the $230 billion corporation, they have you live with members. And some members, they'll pay, some members, they'll pay money, and some members do it for free. But we always lived with members. So I had so many experiences where, you've had this long day, you've been talking to random strangers all day, you come home, and then you are living with a Mormon family who then is still expecting you to basically still be in your missionary dress when you're at home, still like behaving very quietly. Some will have lots of different rules around, you can use our spices, but you can't touch our food. And it's basically like living in a still a hyper strict environment. So you're going from your hyper strict day of following all of these rules to then going home and not really being able to relax or enjoy yourself even at all, because people can hear, even as they can hear you stepping around, they might text you and say, I can hear you walking around up there. Can you please stop walking around?
Oh my
gosh.
So,
you're still kind of under the surveillance of members, even when you're at home. And typically, you know, we sometimes we would just be in a single bedroom and everything else was shared property. So you're already dealing with a psychological impact of always being with your companion. You know, it's called sight and sound. So you always have to be within sight and sound of your companion. You have to sleep in the same room, but not in the same bed. So you're always being watched, and you're always being having someone looming over you. But in one area I served in, they were struggling to find a place for the missionaries to stay, and so they chose this one lady's house, and she was very elderly. She's a kind woman, but she was a hoarder. And so to get to our bedroom in the basement, you basically had to go through all of these aisles of food that, if you looked at the dates, it'd be from the 70s or 80s. And you're kind of walking through this, you know, picture like walking through a basement, maybe 20 paces to the back of the basement. And then we had our room, which was, you know, just 2 small beds and our own bathroom. But everywhere else in that entire basement was just old food. And at the time, I remember when I got picked up by the missionary to go to that new area, she said, just so you know, our housing arrangement, you know, it's just kind of different, but we enjoy it. So she kind of was giving me the heads up while also saying, we're not complaining about this though, so I'm just letting you know that we'll be living here. And so when we get there, I obviously was in shock that we're literally living with a hoarder on our missions, on our Mormon missions. And crazy too that all of these rooms, all of these areas get approved by the church. So people had come to her house, walked into that hoarder's basement, and said, this room, this house is certified for missionaries to live in. And it was very clear. It wasn't that she had just put that food from the 70s and 80s there after they had approved it. It had been there since the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
And so I think I felt very betrayed by how often I felt like I'm showing up, I'm serving a mission, I'm paying to be here, I'm not speaking to my family for months on end, and the best that they can do is put us in a home with a hoarder. And I remember sometimes blowing my nose living there, and it would just be dirt, you know, like it was like I was breathing dirty air.
Oh.
So I don't know if I was getting infected. I never I never went to the hospital or anything or saw a doctor about it, but I just remember blowing my nose and feeling like this air is so dirty that my you know, it's getting into
your respiratory system.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awful. And there was another one that you had mentioned on your video that I think is important to touch on too, just about how the couple was fighting and your your mission leader's response to that.
Yeah, that one was also bad. We had a family that we lived with that this was one where we were just in a small bedroom, and at night we would sometimes hear, maybe once a week or twice a week, we would hear the couple that we were staying with loudly yelling at each other. And at the time, my parents were in the process of getting divorced, and my parents kind of had a history of similar behavior. And I just felt like it was very difficult for me to ignore when, you know, even if your own parents are screaming in the other room as a kid, it's very hard for you to ignore. And then as an adult, I'm hearing this as I'm trying to pray or read my scriptures. And so I felt like it was really kind of, and, you know, some of my mental health issues had been tied up in that before I had even served a mission. So I told my mission president, hey, this is what's happening at this home where we're living, and it's really making it hard for me to focus on my calling as a missionary. And I confided in him, feeling like I could really trust him because, as you know, your mission president is kind of like your bishop, where you talk to him, okay, you know, you send him a letter once a week, and then you meet with him and talk with him about personal things. And so I confided to him basically I was thinking that he would be able to find a different place for us to live in that same ward, so we could not live there anymore. That was the goal, not live there anymore. And it was about, you know, 2 or 3 days later that couple that we were staying with asked us to come into, you know, sit down in their living room. They sat us down and they said, our bishop told us that your mission president told us that you've been complaining about us arguing. Ooh. And so basically, I told my mission president, he contacted their bishop, who then called them into his office and said, you need to stop arguing in front of the missionaries. And so, of course, that then made it full circle back to us, where they said, you've betrayed our trust. We can't believe you'd go behind our backs like that. You've made us look so bad in front of our bishop, and kind of raising their voices at us like, you little, I don't know. I don't think they called us a name necessarily, but they just accused us of spying on them and of lying about them, or what's the word I'm looking for when you're like
snitching.
I don't know the word. Snitching, yeah. Basically saying that we snitched on them and that now they look bad in front of their religious leader. And I remember as I'm sitting there and they're kind of yelling at us, essentially talking angrily at us, just feeling like it was another one of those moments where I had, felt like I trusted this person who I thought was my trusted religious leader, and I confided in him, and now he has made the situation much, much worse. And for as long as I still continue to live there, maybe 2 or 3 months,
Ugh.
They were really rude. They were very cold. They were not, at least any ounce of like welcome that they had once given us in their home was completely turned off. My companion was also very upset with me because she felt like I shouldn't have, snitched on them. And, I'm going from feeling like this almost trauma of my upbringing of having all of this yelling growing up, and then trying to solve it as an adult and feeling trapped to be still stuck in this home where there's still all this yelling and all this anger.
Yeah. And I also have to point out that it's so telling that their response was, you're making us look bad. That is such a common thing within Mormonism, this perfectionism complex where everyone feels like they have to look like the perfect Mormon family. They have to be righteous and worthy and look happy and shiny and bright. And that's something that I always tell people is, yeah, there are happy people in Mormonism, of course, but a lot of times there's a lot brewing under the surface that they don't show you because they have to put on this mask, this face of perfectionism. And the fact that that's why they were upset is you made us look bad in front of our bishop instead of, hey, that wasn't cool, but you're right. Maybe we should calm down a little bit. I'm sorry you heard us yelling. Like nothing like that. It was, you made us look bad, and that's why we're upset with you.
Yeah. And I think I've just felt like it's similar to what I was talking about at BYU, how if you go to the police, they'll tell your bishop.
Yeah.
Just feeling like there's no confidentiality in trying to solve things or trying to say, hey, I'm struggling with this thing, but instead it's just that the organization ultimately every time will always matter more than you do as an individual, and that they're seeing you as a cog in the system, and they're not really seeing you as a human being.
Yeah, well, and also I feel like they probably thought they were doing the best thing because according to the bishop, he's like, oh, they're not living righteously. We need to tell them to be more righteous and not yell. They're not thinking about how that's going to affect you. They're just like, well, clearly they need to work on something. And that's why the couple was so embarrassed, because it was their worthiness called into question, right? So it just illustrates over and over again their priorities and how they approach things and how they think that they need to insert themselves into everybody's lives in a way that makes us feel small and insignificant and unworthy for things that they're just not getting the right support, and you're not getting the right support because they feel like they're the answer when in reality they're the ones just making everything worse.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the fact that I still had to live there, I think that also shows how brainwashed I was, that, an average person might have that experience and just say, well, I'm going to find a new place to live because I can. I do have some memories of feeling like all I want to do is get in this car and drive away and live by myself and just be free of all of this. Mm-hmm. And just the fact that the chains of my mind would not allow me to just say, oh, I don't actually have to, like, I have money in my bank account. I can go live I actually can live anywhere I want, technically. No one is, has me in handcuffs and is making me live in this situation, even with the hoarder. But it's my own choice, as we said, it's the illusion of choice, that if I leave, I'm no longer faithful. I'm no longer showing God I love him. I'm no longer, even just, the idea that on your mission, you're supposed to go through really hard things because it helps you be more converted to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
So when you face these trials, you're not supposed to code them as, hey, this is a sign that something I'm doing is not a great choice, and maybe I could make a different choice to find more happiness in my life. But when you face something like what I'm describing, instead you code it as, this is a trial from Satan. This is a test of my faith. And so I'm going to, whatever it takes to kind of get through this so that I can prove my worthiness is more of how you're kind of training yourself to take it as a test of your faith.
Yeah, a trial from Satan or a gift from God. Because if you didn't go through that, maybe you wouldn't have learned A, B, or C, or you wouldn't have gained a stronger testimony. There's always ways in which they can spin it to make you the problem or make you just go along with it and revert to not having your critical thinking online, just back to, okay, I'm just going to do what you say. I'm going to do what you say and do it with a smile. And so I think that's just so damaging and spiritually manipulating. And we're almost out of time, but I want to know, like, the big question when you're on a mission, did you feel like you were spiritually manipulating people to get baptized, or what were the thoughts behind being forced to kind of meet this number quota of asking people to be baptized?
Yeah, so you're supposed to report your numbers. Basically, there's this whole reporting system. It's very similar to working in sales, which is why Mormon missionaries are good at sales after they come home from their mission or doing summer sales, where your district leader calls you and you report these numbers. So you would report how many lessons you gave to investigators, how many less active people you saw. There's a whole list of metrics that you report on. And so because you're told that these numbers are so important, and you're also goal setting. So as a mission, you might have goals for baptisms, goals for lessons. And so these goals, you feel like you are very committed to following through on them. And so when you meet people, ideally, if I was to kind of make up a mission in my head, when you meet people, you're going to say, how can I help you? How can I serve you? How can I love you? But instead, as a missionary, you're thinking, in order to get a lesson, I have to say an opening prayer, a closing prayer, and I have to invite you to do something. And so you're always viewing every single person you meet as a project that you can basically use as a way to get those numbers that you've committed to be able to get each week. And so I feel like there was so often that people would be just crying about something that was going on in their lives. And all I would be thinking about in the back of my mind is, we have to make sure we can get to these three things so that I can claim that this was a lesson to an investigator, so that I can report it this week to my mission leader. And I know that if a Mormon heard that, they'd say, well, that's because you were viewing it all wrong, and you weren't, that's not how the Lord really would want it. Except we would have explicit conversations about how the higher numbers that we set as goals, the more that we're showing our faith that the Lord will provide us people to teach. So you have explicit conversations about how the higher the numbers you get, the more kind of faith you are showing in the Lord, and that the numbers are directly tied to the salvation of the people who you're there to serve and teach. So I feel like, yes, I definitely had so many moments where I would try to teach people, you're supposed to invite people to be baptized the first time you teach them a lesson. So I'd meet people, and within minutes I'm saying, will you commit to a baptismal date? And
wild. That's wild, Alyssa.
Wild. And you're not even getting into the fact that you wear, like, it's, to me, the craziest irony of a Mormon mission is that you're wearing garments your whole Mormon mission, and you're not allowed to tell them anything about garments.
What?
You, like, if someone were to ask us, I read something on the internet about garments, what are those? You were kind of directed to say, well, first we need to teach you about Joseph Smith, and basically put their question off to the side in order to get them back on program, which is to teach them what's in Preach My Gospel. So I thought it was crazy that I've been through the temple now, I'm wearing garments, and I still will not be speaking a single word about what Mormonism really is to any of these people who I'm trying to share the gospel with.
Right. Talk about a rug pull. They're like, oh, this is so great. I get a second family. I get a community, people who love me, which love bombing is a thing. And then they get in and they're like, okay, you have to stop drinking alcohol, stop drinking coffee. If you're living with your boyfriend, you have to move out or get married. You have to go to the temple and put on this undershirt and these biker shorts you're going to wear for the rest of your life. And if you don't, then you're going to outer darkness, because now you know the truth. And if you know the truth and you turn away, then you're in the worst position than when I found you.
Yeah, I remember this sister missionary arguing with our mission president because they were trying to get these people to get married who had been living together. And she said they can't get married because I think they needed maybe $100 or something for a marriage certificate, or it was essentially that they just didn't have the money. This is from a long time ago, but basically she was saying, can we have a small sum of money provided by the church so that they can get married? And the mission president said, nope, they need to provide that money for themselves. And she said, but they'll get baptized if we can just help them get married. And remember him saying, and that was another thing, we were expressly told, don't offer money, don't offer financial support. This is the wealthiest church in the world is the Mormon church. Basically, if you go on Wikipedia and say, what's the wealthiest church? It's the Mormon church. And we were told, do not offer any monetary or financial aid to anyone you meet, no matter how dire the situation is. You should never offer monetary support.
What?
And we were told that specifically. And I remember meeting people who I just, were in such dire straits, and you're told that you represent Jesus Christ literally, and you are also told not to help people, basically. So it's such a crappy, like, I feel like so often I would just feel gross because I would feel like I'm here to help people, but I'm actually here to get them baptized.
Yeah.
And you're told that the baptism is more helpful than anything else you could do. When you're like boots on the ground, you're like, the baptism is probably one of the last things these people need right now. They need food, or they need shelter, or they were recently abused. And here I am just trying to say, will you commit to a baptismal date like a monster? You feel like a little bit like a monster.
Yeah. I find it interesting that they said no helping them monetarily, because my cousin, she went, now I forgot the country, somewhere in South America, I believe, and they actually helped people get married, and they did pay for things. And I wonder if it's because they just want more members in other countries, and in the US they're like, it's fine.
Yeah, they call it bishop roulette. Different bishops will say different things. I think it's the same thing. It's mission president roulette, where some mission presidents will say, you can baptize whoever, whenever, whatever, or some people will say, no, that's not allowed. So it's very up to the discretion of whatever man happens to be in that mission leadership position.
Yeah.
And some are really kind and compassionate, and I think they know that they can maybe like work the angles a little bit more and say, well, we do have a budget for that. And I think some people will say, well, the church is here to save your soul, not your wallet.
Eek. Yeah. Okay, so for the final question, why did you regret your Mormon mission?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like so many people will say, even if the church was false, I still am glad I served a mission. And that's kind of a sentiment I see echoed a lot on the internet. And I feel like no matter which way you slice the pie, I regret my Mormon mission, because if you are saying, oh, but I got to learn a lot of good things, there are so many ways that someone who's 17, 18, 19 can learn to become a more well-rounded adult that don't involve paying to do 24-hour sales for the Mormon Church. So I regret it from that perspective, that if I wanted to learn to talk to people better, to be able to, take care of myself, to live away from my family, to be compassionate towards other people and be caring. There's lots of other things I could think of that would have taught me those lessons without needing to serve a Mormon mission. I think in addition, I'm not in a vacuum. I did not serve a Mormon mission in a vacuum. My choice to serve a Mormon mission did impact the lives of many other people. And so I brought people into a false religion. I brought people into a religion that I feel was even manipulating me at the time by my, the endowment, etc., the many stories that I've shared. So I feel like it was a waste because I also had what I believe is a negative impact on the people that I talked with and helped to get baptized as a missionary. This is my Preach My Gospel, which I've been referencing, and I don't think you'll be able to see from this far away, but these are all the people who I baptized or I helped get baptized on my Mormon mission. And it's over 25 names. And I feel like it was a waste, not just because I wasted my time or because I didn't get to talk to my family, but because all of those people were directly impacted by my choice to serve a Mormon mission and to bring them into a religion that is demonstrably false. And so it is a waste. And I hope that anyone who's serving a mission can kind of at least brush up against some of these ideas of the other side of a mission that's not just the happy, shiny, sunshine version of a Mormon mission that you're taught and kind of brainwashed to believe you should believe in since you're a kid. There's so many little lessons on the internet that's so easy to find of little children being brainwashed and taught that they should serve a Mormon mission someday.
I hope they call me on a mission.
There's songs, there's activities, there's lessons. And so you are very brought up to believe that this is the best thing you could be doing with your time between the ages of 18 and 20. And so I think because those lessons are so loud and so recurring throughout your childhood as a Mormon kid, that's why I feel so passionately about talking more about these other sides of a mission that I think go untouched as a Mormon, because I think people deserve to know what they're getting into when they choose to do something like serve a Mormon mission.
Yeah. So I said that was the last question, but this is actually my last question. What would you say to people who run into Mormon missionaries out in the world? I often say, just love them. Like, don't be rude to them. Offer them a meal, maybe a drink of water or something, because they're going through a lot. Having been on a mission yourself, what do you want other people to know about what they're going through and how to help?
Yeah, I think a lot of people want to maybe try to dissuade missionaries. I don't think that that's a very good way to go about it, purely because most missionaries will face a lot of negative things that will come into their life as a result of going home early. And so, and even if you were to say to a missionary, Joseph Smith had this many wives, or, what about this history between Black people and the priesthood? Like I said, they're not allowed internet access, really. They can't go Google something. They can't read a book about it. And so anything you might try to inform them of, they're not going to be able to go and research afterwards. It's just going to live in their head rent free, probably. And so I wouldn't try to dissuade them necessarily. The only downside of being kind to them, in my opinion, is that they will typically, I was trained to write the names down of people who would be friendly to us so that other missionaries would come back.
Right.
So, maybe if you don't mind them coming back from time to time and giving them a little bit more, giving them some more water bottles or giving them another granola bar, that's totally fine. But just know that, I was expressly trained that if someone was a margin higher, more kind or interested, or would let us pray with them or would let us talk to them for a little bit, we would usually write their name down in the area book, which would then signify to future missionaries to come back and try again to get them to be converted to the church. So I think that that's the only downside, in my opinion, of being friendly to missionaries, is that you may end up with your name in their area book, which some people don't mind. But I think ultimately I would say that missionaries are I think ultimately I would say that missionaries are still in a phase of their life where they're very young. They're basically still children. They have not experienced anything of the world outside of their family and growing up probably very devout Mormon. And so, just be nice to them. I wouldn't treat them as vicious necessarily. I wouldn't treat, some people will kind of paint a picture of missionaries that is very manipulative and very evil. I feel like they're more, some people have compared Mormon missions to human trafficking. I think that they've been spoon-fed an idea since birth, and now they're just still taking part in their religious tradition, and they haven't really had the opportunity to look outside of that yet. Mm-hmm. And so they don't think they need to be, they're not 50-year-old men necessarily, or they're not quite old people who kind of should know better than trying to manipulate people into joining a false religion. They're still basically in the realm of teenagers that are just trying to do what their family wants them to do and be part of this religious tradition that they've been taught to believe in since birth.
Yeah, well said. It's funny because when you were talking about if you are nice to them, more will come. And I just had this horrible visual of putting food out for a cat and then more cats come to eat. If you feed them, more will come. And if you're okay with that, then keep feeding them. They need meals. So this has been awesome. We've already gone so far over time and we didn't even get to your deconstruction or life afterwards. I feel like there is a live that we could kind of bring that in together, your deconstruction process, what happened after your mission, and kind of how you decided to overcorrect intentionally when becoming a mother. If you're down, we can do that.
Yes, I would love to do that. And don't forget to subscribe to Cults to Consciousness so that when we do the live together, you guys can see it. I've never done a live, so you'll have to hold me.
Oh, I'm breaking your live cherry. Look at me go. This is exciting. Yeah, so after you watch this episode, if you started here, make sure to go to Alyssa's channel and catch the episode we did on Mormon loopholes, soaking, all the stuff that's super taboo. We're going to get into unapologetically, and make sure you check out the live that will follow this episode soon, in a few days probably. And if you have questions in the meantime for Alyssa, leave them in the comments so that we can maybe address a few of them on the live starting out. And I need your Linda Listen moment, sassy statement as the viral video of the toddler goes, or something inspirational.
Linda Listen, the Book of Mormon, there's no proof for it. It's a made-up book. Joseph Smith plagiarized it. And you don't need to base your entire life off a book that is completely false. And the truth is that you can't know truth just from a feeling in your tummy or a feeling in your heart. There's many, many other ways to know truth. And so if you're living your entire life in a religion that makes you unhappy based off of a feeling you had once in your heart or in your tummy or a burning in your bosom, it's okay. You don't have to keep going with something that's making you unhappy. It's time to let it go.
That was amazing. You were coming in hot. You had points, you had facts, you had sass, you had all the things that should be in a Linda Listen. I love it. That was great. Everyone go subscribe to Alyssa. Leave those comments in the comment box below, those questions. You can find her in the description box, but Alyssa D. Grenfell over all of the platforms. And make sure you go check out her content because it's fantastic. And do you have any final thoughts before we go?
That's it. Thank you so much for having me on, and I really appreciate it. If you guys want to hear more about my story, I have lots of videos about my life after leaving the church on my channel as well. And thank you again to Cults to Consciousness for having me on.
You are very welcome. Oh, and you wrote a book. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. How to Leave Mormonism.
Yes, and if you are in the process of leaving the Mormon Church, I suggest checking out my book, How to Leave the Mormon Church, An Ex-Mormon's Guide to Rebuilding After Religion. I put everything I feel like I learned as I was leaving the church in this book and made it basically chapter by chapter. So if you're ready to think about sex and sexuality, go to that chapter. You can go to the chapter about changing your political affiliation. There's everything you could think of that I could at least come up with, I put in this book. So if you're in the process of leaving Mormonism yourself, definitely recommend checking it out.
Amazing. Do all the things. Links in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave those comments below. If you want to join Patreon, you can at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. We have some merch at cults2consciousness.com. And if you like this video, I'll definitely link some more down here below that we may have mentioned throughout the episode. And if you like the channel, but you don't have as much time to listen to long form Cults to Consciousness clips, where you can find 8 to 10 minute clips from some of our older interviews that we are resurfacing, that will be in the description as well if you want to find that. And thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I'll link to more down here below. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.